really what I want to talk about today is the voice platform wars. And when we talk about the voice platform wars, we're really talking about all the people who are trying to create space and dominance in the newly emerging area of AI and voice assistants. So just to get started, I want to let you know, I'm the founder and editor of VoiceBot.ai. We are covered very broadly by media around the world. We really focus on news, analysis, research, and we also have a podcast. So I recommend you check those out. We are at VoiceBot.ai. You can find us there. So let's get right into this. So the first thing I want to do is do a little bit of a disclaimer up front. And that disclaimer is, if you look at this map, most of my focus is going to be early on in US. And I don't want you to think there's a US bias. These are just the companies that are doing the most work right now in the space. And they're investing in the space, and they have the most global footprint. But what we're going to see is it's really a bipolar world. So I'll talk a little bit about China as well, because the other companies that are doing it are in China. And this really comes down to a couple different things. One is, these are the organizations that have made the choice to focus in this area. They also have some current dominance in a particularly relevant area, and they have made a choice that this is going to be very important to them. So what we'll get into first is the platform evolution. So I think what a lot of people understand is that what we're doing is, with voice, is it represents a new platform. And that's a platform that we can look back at previous platforms and learn some things from. So from the first standpoint, we think about the graphical user interface and the click interface that brought the internet to us. And that was a really important platform. And a lot of the companies that we saw on that previous slide really made their fortunes in that space. And then more recently, we've had touch on mobile, and that also changed the user interface, but it also made this data available to us all the time, everywhere. And then finally, what we have now is you can speak. And this is a completely different platform. It changes the way that we interact with the technology. And I think one of the most important things for people to understand that each of these platforms was built on a different enabling technology. So for the internet, and for what we had, is we had the World Wide Web and TCP/IP that enabled us to generate information and spread that, or be able to access it from anywhere connected around the world. The next one was really cloud technology was critical for mobile devices to work properly. If we didn't have cloud, we wouldn't be able to deliver all the content we do to mobile devices so effectively. And we also had fiber for World Wide Web, and we had LTE for cloud, which enabled that connectivity from a backhaul standpoint. But now what we have is we have AI. And AI has a couple of different functions here. But one of the key things is there's a architectural function that is different than the previous two. The previous two were about delivering content more efficiently. AI is about sometimes delivering content more efficiently, but also actually determining what the best type of content is based on the user intent. So in the previous paradigms, we didn't have this concept of user intent. That was a really big focus. The user choice was constrained by what you could do on the screen. So they could only do a few things. Whatever they did, we knew what their intent was, and we delivered the payload. With AI, it's different. It's much more open in terms of what you can do, and particularly with voice, you can ask things. The CEO of Voices, Peter Cahill, calls this sort of the unconstrained aspect of it. And we can deliver many different types of things. And so each of these enabling technologies also came along at the same time as the new user interface, and that's really important to, for people to understand that it's not just the UI change, but there's a underlying technology platform change as well. So what's all the fuss about? And I think it's kind of like speaking to the converted in this group, because if you're at BotsCamp, you already believe that something important is going on here. But let me give you just a perspective here on what happened. With the internet for digital content, what we did is we really transformed the distribution capabilities and the types of transactions that we could do, the speed and the nature of those transactions. With mobile, we had those same things. We put those into a mobile environment, but we also really moved into this area of attention. Because the devices were with us all the time and not just at a place where we were sitting and looking at a monitor, they really had the opportunity to capture our attention throughout the day. And that became one of the key currencies that a lot of the companies of the mobile era built upon. When we get to speech, what we see is the distribution and transactions are also very important. We've seen, the distribution of content, whether it be music or other types of content, weather data, those types of things moving to these platforms. We also see transactions. Amazon is selling about 10% more in annual transactions to the owners of their Echo products. And we also have attention, because if you're spending time with a voice assistant, you're not spending time with one of the other technologies. The key thing that they're concerned about is these companies losing their distribution advantage, losing their transactional advantages, or losing their attention. But they're also terrified of the concept of agency, because once we add AI into here, voice assistants can make choices on our behalf. In the past, we would have to go out, we would actually look for things or take steps based on the habits we'd already formed around the previous platforms. Now that we have this new platform, there's new habits being formed, and those platforms themselves, once they learn about us, can make choices. And those choices might disintermediate some of the organizations that were more powerful in the previous wave. So let's go next to the platform. Actually, I skipped to the wrong place. So let's now talk to a little bit about the data behind the story. So the question is, how do we get here, and how do we know that this is something it's inevitable and not just a fad? Well, the first thing we saw was voice searches started to increase very significantly. And what that revealed was there was latent user demand for voice interfaces, voice interaction with devices. As soon as the technology was made available, you see that voice search in the lower right-hand corner goes up and to the right, because people started to use it much more frequently. And what we see here is that it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine. The coal miners used to use a canary to be an early warning system of when air quality was getting bad in the coal mine, and the humans needed to depart. Well, that voice search is a canary in the coal mine for this whole change to voice interactive computing. And so what we see already is about 40% of voice search users, or 40% of mobile device users are voice search users now. We see that about 20% of voice search or 20% of all search is voice now. And that we're moving within the next 3 years to about a 40 to 50% range of voice computing. So search is really telling us something about what the demand is of consumers for this interaction. And I also like this chart from Mary Meeker that she puts out. She's with Kleiner Perkins, which is a big VC firm in the US. She talks about this march of voice, a relentless march of voice. In 2014, 10% of queries on Baidu were through search. And then Siri had 1 billion searches. And then, more recently, 20% of Android searches became voice enabled. And we see that the chairman of Baidu says that he expects it to be 15 or 50% within just a couple of years. And one of the key things we think about when you look at the data in the space, it's not just about voice search. In fact, there's some data, Edison Research did this data, smart speaker users, that 50% use smart speakers for 6 or more tasks on a regular basis. And 25% of all owners use them for 11 or more tasks. So it's not just search, it's very broad-based, and it's not just music or weather. People are using these for a dozen different tasks on a regular basis, and that's forming habits. The other thing that we see is that everyone likes to use smart speakers. So once one is entered into a home, Radio Center, a research firm out of the UK, found that at least 75% of the people in the home use it. Even the elderly, even the very young children will start using the device. And in most of the core cohorts of users, over 90% will use it. And I think what we found is that people have fallen in love with these things. So another survey, well-regarded survey here in the US around this space is 42% of owners have said these are essential to their everyday lives, and almost 2/3 say they wouldn't want to go back to life before they had a voice assistant. 45% plan to purchase a new one within the next 6 months. And that's both non-owners and owners. So owners are adding to it. And about 42% of homes right now, households in the US, and closer to, I think, 50% in the UK, actually have multiple devices. So people are really turning these into tools for their everyday life. The other thing we see on the data front is that developers also care about this. And so developers, there's been latent demand on the consumer side, but developers have been happy to develop onto these platforms as well. And we know this, that 2 years ago, there were only 3 custom Alexa skills. And 2 years later, almost to the day, there were 20,000. So we see a lot of activity there. And we also see consumer demand. And there's this, we call about this day of reckoning. So most organizations who are analysts really significantly underestimated how many of these devices would be sold. And in Q2 of this year, you see a 10x growth, where it went from just about 440,000 smart speakers globally sold last year to 4.2 million this year. And then just a couple weeks after that, in the second week of July this year, 3.3 million Amazon Echoes were sold in one day by Amazon on their Prime Day. And so what we're seeing is this distribution of the smart speakers go out, but it's not just about smart speakers, because I think we all know that there's 100 million Android users and there's 375 million Siri users out there. But one of the key things about smart speakers is they're increasing the AI voice assistant use. And so what we see from other data is that there's about 9x the number of usage on smart speakers in terms of frequency of use. And so we see that's a really important thing today in shaping habits for people who are looking at this. So let's break into the players really quickly, and I want to move quickly through this. But one of the key things about the players, I break them down in a couple different tiers, is the first tier, these are people very active today with very robust systems and offerings. And each of them has different assets to bring. And what we think about is Amazon has the commerce graph. Because they sell more than everybody else. And they have certain assets like Amazon.com and AWS in order to host these things. And they've got a lot of products out there, a lot of Echo products. In fact, more were announced yesterday. And so they're very active, but they have some assets here. With Google, what we see there is they have got the knowledge graph. So their expertise is information. And voice assistants, one of the key things they do in addition to transactions is provide information. And so they have some objectives around protecting that knowledge graph. And ultimately, their business is driven not by product sales like Amazon, but by advertising. So their products and some of the things that they're doing and trying to leverage are really focused on that. If we look at Microsoft, which actually surprised everyone earlier this year by telling people that they had 145 million monthly active users on Cortana, they have the same, what we would call the productivity graph. And so the Microsoft Office franchise with 1 billion global users, they're using this as an opportunity to move beyond that desktop and to really reinforce that productivity, but also really touch consumers and expand their reach. They also have a lot of assets to bring to the table here, like Azure and Windows and Bing. But less robust on the product side. They still have yet to launch that Invoke product speaker from Harman Kardon. So I want to call what I call the next group of the players in waiting a tier 1A, and only because they have less robust offerings in market today. Now, obviously Siri or Apple has Siri, and I call this the fanboy graph just because it's sort of a joke, but they have this fully integrated group of products, and they have very loyal customers and a very large customer base globally. And they're really focused on making Siri central, but what they've done is they've have this really robust product portfolio around the person, the things you wear, the things you put in your ears, and the things you carry, like your phone. And they're a little later to market with the smart speaker, like the HomePod, but are essentially entering that tier 1 category this month. And then we have Facebook, which has the social graph. So they touch everybody, and they're among the people who are the most concerned about losing attention to these smart speakers, because their whole business is based on attention engagement, so they can drive that advertising model. They've got Facebook M, which is a smart chatbot, and that's a good foundation for them, and we expect them to have a fully voice enabled solution in the and coming next year. Plus, they have these tremendous assets like Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, video. They've got a really large bot developer community in the tens of thousands. So they're going to be a player here in some way, and it's not clear how that's going to shake out. And then we'll just move into sort of tier two, and we'll come to the conclusion here. Here we've got Samsung. Samsung is the largest global sale of mobile phones, but what a lot of people don't know is they're one of the largest sellers of appliances and other devices. So they have this device graph out there, and that's why it's so important for them to have a voice assistant as opposed to being completely dependent on a third party like Google and the way they are with Android. They want to have Bixby, their tool. They want that to be able to control that user interface and develop a great user experience. So they've got this global customer base, and they've got some assets, but they're really struggling to get to market. So they're a little bit behind some of the others. And the asset base that they have isn't quite as strong or as resilient as some of the other players. And then we'll bring up IBM, and IBM is sort of an interesting player because they're a global player as well. They have Watson. They're really focused on solving hard problems, and they're not just focused on the AI in the front end to understand the voice, but they're also interested on the AI in the back end to analyze data and bring back more effective answers for people. And so what do we do with all these things? We've got all these graphs and these big companies with different assets. Well, one of the first hypotheses I have is we break this down into B2B and B2C type of capabilities. And naturally what's happening is each of these companies is focusing in the area where they have better assets and more access to growth. And so when you look at it like this, you can see how Amazon and Google are so fiercely fighting against each other. And whenever one of them has an announcement coming up, like next week for Google, Amazon will make very big announcements the week before in order to capture mind share. On the B2B side, it's less head-on, but you can also see across this chasm, it makes a lot of sense that Amazon and Microsoft would link up because they're really not directly competing in many areas. It's easier for them to be complementary. Now, Google is interesting because they have also DeepMind, and so they're doing a little bit better job of maybe traversing these two areas, but DeepMind is very early in its developing if it's enterprise customers. So I just wanted to lay out this framework and say, these are how the battle lines are drawing up in these wars. This is where you're going to start to see some things shake out. And I just wanted to close with a couple of very quick things here. And we'll call this sort of the bonus content. And what you can see is China, and this is the other part of that bipolar AI world, and particularly with voice. Every one of these four companies has a smart speaker. They've developed voice assistants, varying levels of sophistication. But what we see here is some corollary to the US tech giants, and that Baidu is really like Google, and that it was search and information. You've got Alibaba, which is in some ways similar to Amazon, and that they are the biggest seller of products in China. We have Tencent on the entertainment front, which is much more similar to where Facebook, occupies space today, maybe a little bit of Google, and then Huawei and the devices, maybe a low-end version of Apple. And so what you see is really the dominant players in each of these different areas in both the U.S. and in China, really investing heavily in this space around AI and voice because they all know that it's critical to their long-term survival. And I'll just leave on that point. Who is going to be the next $100 billion giant? The one thing that we know is we see all these giant companies on this slide, and they all have a play, and they're going to be important players in this space. But each of them rode the wave of a new platform being launched. So Google didn't exist even when the internet first came out. Facebook really was successful, but wasn't as successful as it is today before mobile came out. It really made itself. Apple remade itself on mobile. Amazon didn't exist until we had the internet. IBM and Microsoft, kudos to them for hanging on, through these areas where they've started to get displaced by these other players who have been more successful in navigating the new platform changes. So the question I have is, who's going to be, the next Google, the next Facebook, that's going to take AI and move it to the next level? And there are some players out there that might be candidates for that, but I think for sure we don't know yet. the one thing I would tell everybody listening today, though, is all these players on this screen are very important, but there's going to be some that aren't listed yet, and they might come from anywhere in the globe that are going to be the logo icons that'll be on the slide when we talk about the next platform transformation. And that's all I have today. I really just wanted to talk to people about the data, that space is moving really fast, that this idea of attention and agency are really important here, and that all of these players that have a lot of cash and are really frightened about being left on the wrong side of this new transition are investing heavily so that they can sustain their position over time and ward off some of these new startups that will be looking to displace them.